If you truly knew that you weren't the doer of your actions in the way that you previously assumed yourself to be, what would change in your life? Would you still get up in the morning, make plans, go to work, answer emails, get on with whatever you normally do in your day? Or would you simply sit there waiting for something to happen by itself? Many people feel confused about this aspect of the teachings of non-doership because of the assumption that without a sense of there being a doer, there wouldn't be any inclination to initiate action, to make action happen. But is this really the case? In my last video, I looked at the influence of the three gunas and how all activity in creation takes place within prakriti, the changing field of nature. And if you haven't watched that one yet, I'll link to it in the description box below. In that video, I pointed out the extraordinary amount of intelligent activity that's already taking place within us without any sense of I'm doing it at all. Our hearts beat, our lungs breathe, and our digestive systems digest our food without us consciously directing any of it. But something interesting happens when we move from the functions that only seem to involve our body to the functions that can also involve the mind. So your heart continually beats, but you don't have the sense, I'm beating my heart, I'm responsible for that beating. But when a thought arises just by itself, the sense comes, I thought that. Or when your intellect weighs up two possibilities, you'll believe, I made that decision. But according to the philosophy of yoga and Advaita Vedanta, the mind is also just a part of prakriti. It's simply another instrument of the faculty of the body-mind organism, just as the heart, lungs, and intestines are also instruments. So then thinking, remembering, comparing, planning, and discriminating are functions of the mind and intellect, just as pumping the blood is the function of the heart. Which raises an interesting question. Why does activity occurring in the mind give us such a powerful sense that there must be somehow an individual producing it? I want to explore that question in this video and look at what it actually means to say that actions can happen, decisions can be made, and life can function perfectly well without there being any sense that you are the doer of any of it. So I'm Catherine, and when I make these videos, I draw on 30 years of spiritual practice, including more than 15 living in an ashram in the Himalayas. My aim is to make these timeless teachings easier to understand, but more importantly, easier to recognize in your own direct experience. So when we actually investigate, it's relatively easy to acknowledge that some thoughts simply arise without us doing them. But what about when we make a decision? Surely that's where a doer must come in, right? Let's say someone says something that you find irritating. Almost immediately a response comes to your mind. Perhaps it isn't a particularly wise one, and for a moment there's a strong impulse to retaliate. But then you pause, perhaps another thought arises. Actually, maybe I'd better not say that. You remember what happened last time you reacted in anger. Or something you've learnt through spiritual practice comes to mind. So you consider the consequences, perhaps think of a better way to respond and make a decision. Now, on the everyday level, it's perfectly reasonable to say, I chose not to react. And the teaching of non-doership doesn't mean that no experience of choosing takes place. There was an impulse, there was discrimination, different possibilities were considered. A decision was made and one action took place rather than another. But if we look more closely, where did all of that come from? You didn't consciously create the first angry response before it arose. You didn't create all of the previous experiences that taught you that reacting in that way might not be a good idea. Perhaps your ability to pause has been strengthened by years of meditation, or perhaps you've simply learnt through making the same mistake enough times. Your present mood will have an influence. Your constitution, your temperament will have an influence. Your relationship with the other person and how they normally behave towards you will have an influence. All of that is present within this one apparently simple moment of choosing. But I think we need to see something clearly here, which is that even decision-making doesn't necessarily imply that there's an individual entity making the decision. Choice, intention, effort, discernment, all of those things can happen. Action can be initiated. All of those are functions taking place within the body and mind. And none of them require the additional sense that I, as a separate individual, am making all of this happen. In fact, they don't need any sense that I am a separate individual at all. I think this is important to realize because otherwise there's the risk that the idea of non-doership can turn into a kind of fatalism. We can start thinking, well, if I'm not the doer, why am I going to bother making any efforts? There's no point in thinking clearly about what I should do. I'll just sit here and wait until something happens. But that isn't what this teaching is pointing towards at all. Sometimes thinking something through very carefully is exactly what's required. If you're deciding whether to change jobs or move house or have a medical procedure or something, gathering information, considering different possibilities, and using your discrimination are all part of the intelligent functioning of the mind. The question is whether that requires the additional psychological sense, I am the one making all of this happen. We can see something quite interesting about this when we look at the natural world. Think of a flock of birds migrating in winter. At a certain point, as the season changes and the conditions are right, the birds gather and leave. Some species travel thousands of miles, navigating across countries and even oceans to reach their destination. There's clearly an extraordinary intelligence operating through the whole process, but it's highly unlikely that one of the birds sitting on a branch the night before is worrying, is tomorrow definitely the right day to leave? What if I get tired halfway? What if the weather changes? Am I going to get along with all of these birds for the next 3,000 miles? Because the intelligence is there without all of that prevarication and psychological commentary that human beings so often add. And of course, I'm not suggesting that we should stop thinking and become like migrating birds. Our capacity to reason, discuss, plan, and discriminate is enormously valuable. But I think the bird's example points us towards something important. Intelligence itself doesn't require a sense of individual doership. In fact, interestingly, I think we probably all know from our own experience that intelligence seems to function best, it acts most freely when we're not trying to second guess it. You might be speaking and the right words simply come, or doing something, your hands seem to know what to do just by themselves. But when the mind suddenly steps in with doubt and starts thinking, am I doing this properly? What if I get it wrong? What will everyone think? That doubt is simply the result of the identification with the fictitious and unnecessary sense of being the doer. And that additional layer of identification actually interferes with the intelligent functioning that was already taking place. There's another analogy which can help us to see where that sense of doership comes in. If you think of the internet browser program that you use on your laptop or on your phone, I'll say Safari because that's the one I use, but maybe you use Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge or something. So take a computer program like Safari. You can happily say, Safari loaded this web page, or Safari won't download this file, or Safari is being so slow today. And that's perfectly useful language. But we don't need to imagine that there's actually an individual entity inside the computer called Safari, personally responsible for making something happen or stopping it from happening. What we call Safari is a particular functioning within a much larger system of hardware and software and internet connections and countless other processes. So something similar happens if someone says, Catherine made this video. There's nothing wrong with saying that, but what exactly does Catherine refer to? As I said, my words in this video have been shaped by many years of spiritual practice and many years of sitting with a teacher who was completely free from any sense of separation and any sense of doership. They've also been influenced by the things I've read and by the functioning of memory and the thoughts that spontaneously arose. And in fact, the initial inspiration for these two videos on non-doership came from someone who made a comment on social media that I should stop making videos and practice non-doership instead, as if those two things were incompatible. So if I say I made a video, the problem isn't with the word I, but with what we imagine that word refers to. And this is where the Ahaṅkāra, the Sanskrit word usually translated as ego, can be particularly useful. Because the Ahaṅkāra isn't that which carries out action. It has no use. It doesn't do anything. Its role is simply to create the sense of individual identity which says, I am the doer. So a decision is made, an action takes place, and then the sense comes, I did that. And if you believe in this claim of doership, then a whole other layer of experience follows. If something succeeds, you'll probably feel proud. If it fails, you'll have the sense that I have failed, or even worse, I am a failure. If someone appreciates what you've done, you feel good about yourself. If someone criticizes something you've done, you feel as though they're criticizing you. And even before any action has happened, this Ahaṅkāra, this sense of I am the doer, can create an intense anxiety, thinking, what if I get it wrong? What will people think? What if it doesn't turn out the way I want? So this sense of doership isn't what makes action happen, but it creates a great deal of psychological burden surrounding the action. And this is one of the reasons the teachings of non-doership can be so valuable. Because when you recognize the sense, I am the doer, for what it is, a great sense of freedom starts to arise. Because you don't have to add the additional burden of me onto everything you do. And this brings us to the deepest level of the teaching. The body and mind are part of prakriti, part of the ever-changing movement of the three gunas. The body acts, the mind thinks, the intellect discriminates, decisions are made. There's nothing wrong with any of that. Because ultimately, these teachings of Advaita aren't telling you, the individual body and mind, that you need to learn how to become a non-doer. They're pointing to the fact that what you are has never been confined to the body and mind. There's a verse in the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna describes a wise person as someone who perceives inaction in action and action in inaction. This is just one of many Gita verses dedicated to this topic, which is why in my online Gita course, actually, which starts next month, I have a whole module on non-doership. I'll put the details about that in the description box below as well. But coming back to that inaction in action and action in inaction verse. This can sound rather like a mysterious riddle at first, but let's look at what it really means. On the level of prakriti, on the level of mind and body, action is continually taking place. As we've seen, even when you're sitting apparently still, all sorts of physical and mental processes can be happening. So what appears outwardly as inaction is actually full of activity. So that's the action in inaction part. But from another perspective, we can say that all activity is being known. You know your body is moving. You know when a thought appears and when it disappears. You know when a decision is being considered. And importantly, you're also aware of the sense, I am doing this. You know that sense. So even the sense of being the doer is something that's known. So if the Ahaṅkāra, or the sense of doership, is something you're aware of, can that sense of doership be the awareness that knows it? Or is even the feeling that I am doing this just another appearance within awareness? So this is where we arrive at the other part of Krishna's statement. Because the body acts, but awareness itself doesn't act. Thoughts move, but awareness doesn't move. Decisions are made and action follows, but the awareness in which and by which all of this is known remains completely unchanged. So there can be tremendous activity taking place, and yet at the deepest level of your being, complete stillness. That's the inaction in action. And this is ultimately why non-doership is much less about what you do and much more about who you know yourself to be while activity is taking place. So giving up your sense of doership isn't an instruction to become passive. And neither is it about trying to get rid of the sense of doership, because that can very easily just become another project for the ego. I must become the non-doer. I'm experiencing far too much doership. I really need to get better at this non-doing, which is rather ironic when you think about it. But then how can we practice non-doership? Simply by beginning to notice. A thought arises, an intention arises, a decision is made, an action takes place. And perhaps there's still a familiar sense of I'm doing this. You might notice that too. But what's the nature of the one that's aware of all of that? Is that one doing the knowing or creating the awareness? Or is awareness simply the nature of what's present? Is it involved in what it's aware of? So this is where the teaching of non-doership ultimately points us. We don't need to somehow train the person to stop being the doer, but we need to begin to recognize that the person, with the thoughts, decisions, intentions, and actions, is itself part of what's being known. But the awareness that knows all of this isn't making any efforts to be aware. It isn't deciding to know one thought and then the next. Knowing is simply its nature. So then the practice of non-doership isn't necessarily about doing anything differently at all. It's about recognizing more clearly what is action and who you truly are. The body acts, the mind thinks, the intellect discriminates, life continues to unfold. But the awareness that you are remains exactly as it has always been. The non-doing presence in which all doing arises and is known.